When I finally understood what those 3-day absences really were, my first reaction wasn't heartbreak. It wasn't rage either, though that came later in waves so powerful they nearly knocked me off my feet in the middle of my own kitchen. My first reaction, the one I'm almost ashamed to admit out loud, was relief. The kind of relief you feel when a word you've been trying to remember for weeks suddenly surfaces on its own. That quiet, involuntary exhale of, oh, so that's what it was. Because somewhere deep in the part of me I had spent 31 years carefully training not to listen, I had already known. I just hadn't known what I knew. My name is Dorothea Calloway. Most people call me Dot. I was 63 years old when I followed a paper trail that led me to a house 47 miles from my own. A house with a climbing rose on the front porch and a mailbox painted blue. A house where a woman I had never met in my life was raising 2 children who shared my husband's last name. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning is where all the signs were planted, like seeds in dark soil, years before I had the eyes to see what was growing. But I also need to tell you the end, because the end is why I'm here, sitting in this chair with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me, and a heart that has been broken and mended and broken again, and is now, finally, genuinely whole in a way it never was, even in the best years of my marriage. The end is about choosing yourself when everyone, including your own memories, is telling you to stay small. The end is about a 63-year-old woman who had spent her entire adult life being somebody's wife learning, for the very first time, how to simply be herself. Before we go any further, I need to ask something of you. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, if you're already leaning in a little closer to wherever you're watching this, please take just 1 second to hit that subscribe button and ring that little bell. I know everyone says that, but here at Real Grandma Stories, these aren't manufactured dramas. These are real lives, real pain, real courage, and real comebacks. And every single like, every comment, every subscription is what keeps this community alive and growing. It costs you nothing but a tap, and it means the world to the women whose stories we share. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love knowing this family stretches across every corner of the world. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. I grew up in Millhaven, Ohio, not a town most people have heard of, and that's exactly the way most people in Millhaven liked it. It sat between Columbus and nowhere in particular, the kind of place where the grain elevator was the tallest structure for miles, and everybody knew which family owned which field. My father, Gerald Briggs, worked at the Carver County Co-op for 34 years. Loading feed bags and keeping inventory on a handwritten ledger he was still using when computers had already put a man in orbit. My mother, Vera, cleaned houses 3 days a week and spent the other 4 keeping ours running on a budget so tight it squeaked. We were not poor in the way that makes the news. We were poor in the quiet American way, the way where the lights stay on and the pantry is never completely bare. But there is no such thing as extra. No extra money, no extra room, no extra time. My parents had 3 children, my older brother Franklin, me, and my younger sister Patrice, and we shared a 2-bedroom house on Sycamore Lane with linoleum floors that my mother kept so clean you could eat off them. Mama believed that the condition of your floors was a moral statement. I have carried that belief my entire life, for better and for worse. I was not an unhappy child. I want to be clear about that because sometimes, when a story ends in betrayal, people assume the unhappiness must have started at the root. It didn't. My childhood was full of fireflies and county fairs, and my father's laugh, which was the kind of laugh that filled an entire room and spilled out the windows. We went to First Presbyterian every Sunday, ate pot roast every Sunday afternoon, and watched The Wonderful World of Disney every Sunday evening. The rhythms of our life were as reliable as the seasons, and I found great comfort in that reliability. What I did not have as a child was a strong model for what a marriage between equals looked like. That is not a criticism of my parents. They were products of their time and their circumstances, and they loved each other genuinely. But my father made the decisions, and my mother made the peace. My father spoke first, and my mother confirmed. My father had opinions, and my mother had accommodations. I watched this dynamic for 18 years and absorbed it the way children absorb everything, completely and without realizing it. I met Gerald Calloway at a Friday night dance at the Millhaven Elks Lodge in the summer of 1979. I was 20 years old, working as a receptionist at Dr. A. Patterson's dental office on Main Street, and I was wearing a yellow sundress my mother and I had made from a simplicity pattern over the course of 2 weekends. Gerald was 24, broad-shouldered, with dark hair combed back in a way that made him look like he had stepped out of a magazine rather than off the family farm 12 miles east of town. He asked me to dance. He held my hand with confidence, not aggression. There's a difference, and I knew it even then. He smelled like Old Spice and clean laundry. He told me he was working at Carver County Savings and Loan as a junior loan officer, that he'd gotten his associate's degree from Columbus State, that he planned to get his full bachelor's eventually. He was ambitious in the careful, Midwestern way, not loud about it, just steady. He said he wanted to make something of himself. I was charmed. I was thoroughly, completely charmed. We dated for 14 months. He was attentive, brought flowers on my birthday, came to Sunday pot roast at my parents' house, and won over my father by knowing the batting averages of the 1975 Cincinnati Reds. He was polite to my mother, kind to little Patrice, and respectful of my boundaries in the way that young women in 1979 were taught to evaluate as the highest possible virtue in a prospective husband. We were married on September 13, 1980 at First Presbyterian, in a ceremony with 72 guests and a reception at my parents' house where my mother made 3 different kinds of finger sandwiches and my Aunt Roberta's butter cake, which was so good it deserved its own line on the invitation. I wore a dress I had helped to alter from a consignment find. Ivory satin with a high neck and small pearl buttons down the back, and I was, genuinely, radiantly happy. I was 21 years old, and I believed with my whole heart that I was beginning the best chapter of my life. Gerald and I settled into a rental house on Birchwood Drive. He continued at the Savings and Loan, moving up steadily over the years. Junior officer to loan officer to branch manager to regional manager, a title he held by the time he was in his mid-40s. I left Dr. Patterson's office when our daughter Renata was born in 1983 and became what was then simply called a homemaker, which in practice meant managing every moving part of a household while Gerald managed the income that made the household possible. We had our son Marcus 2 years after Renata in 1985, and our second daughter Claire arrived in 1989. By every external measure, we had built exactly what we set out to build. By the time I was 35, we owned a 3-bedroom colonial on Maple Crest Drive, a real house, not a rental. With a proper yard and a 2-car garage and a kitchen, I had renovated myself over the course of one ambitious summer with tile I found on clearance at the building supply store. Gerald drove a company car. I drove a Buick LeSabre that I was proud of, purchased used but in excellent condition. The children went to Millhaven regional schools, got decent grades, played in the band, and on the soccer team. We were, as far as anyone looking from the outside could see, a perfectly ordinary, perfectly solid American family. The first business trip came in 1991. Renata was 8, Marcus 6, Claire just barely 2. Gerald had been promoted to regional manager earlier that year, a title that came with a salary increase, a new office in the county seat, and, he explained very matter-of-factly on a Thursday evening in October, the need for periodic travel. He showed me the schedule. Columbus first, a 2-night stay for a regional conference with representatives from 6 county branches. He packed his good suit, his overnight bag, his briefcase. He kissed me and the children. He drove away. He came back 3 days later with a box of Fannie Mae chocolates for me and small stuffed animals from the Columbus Zoo gift shop for the children. He smelled of hotel soap and showed me a conference brochure. He seemed perfectly, unremarkably himself. I thought nothing of it. Why would I? I had married a man who was rising in his career. Travel was part of that. It was a reasonable, adult, ordinary thing. Looking back now, 32 years later, with everything I know, I understand that October 1991 was when the architecture of my deception was laid. But I had no way to see it then. None. And I want to be honest about that, truly honest, because I think it matters enormously that we stop asking women why they didn't see it sooner, and start acknowledging how carefully, how expertly, and over how many years the people who deceive them build the walls. By 1993, the business trips had settled into a reliable rhythm, roughly once every 6 to 8 weeks, always 3 days, always involving one of a small rotating cast of plausible locations, Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, once Indianapolis, for a multi-state banking conference that Gerald showed me a registration receipt for. He always brought something back. Not expensive gifts, nothing that would seem like guilt, though of course I didn't frame it that way then. Practical things. A good pen from a hotel gift shop, a local jam from a farmer's market near wherever he'd been, a book he thought I'd like from a Barnes and Noble in Columbus. Those books in particular I treasured. He knew I loved to read. He knew what genres I preferred: historical fiction, the occasional mystery, biographies of women who had done unusual things. The books felt intimate, felt like evidence of a husband who was thinking of me even when he was away. They felt like care. I am going to take a moment here to ask you, if you're watching this and you've been there, if you know exactly what it feels like to have evidence weaponized as comfort, to just breathe with me for a second. Because this is where it gets complicated. This is where we have to hold two true things at once. I was deceived, and I was also, in the specific and limited ways he chose to show it, genuinely cared for. Both things were real. The caring does not erase the deception, and the deception does not erase the caring. They existed together, and that is perhaps the most disorienting thing of all to sit with, even now. Gerald was, in all the ways that did not involve the secret he was keeping, a good husband. He showed up for the children. He came to school plays and soccer games. He fixed the gutters without being asked. He held my hand at my father's funeral in 1997 and cried alongside me, which was one of the rare occasions I saw him cry, and I loved him more fiercely in that moment than I had in years. He noticed when I was tired and suggested I take weekends off from cooking. He remembered our anniversary without being reminded. He laughed at my jokes. He was good to me. That is the truth. And it is also true that the whole time he was living another life entirely. I did not know this for another 18 years. The life we built on Maple Crest Drive had a particular texture that I can still feel when I close my eyes and try to bring it back. Not the grand moments, but the everyday ones. The way the morning light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle in October and made the whole room glow amber. The sound of the coffee percolator, which I preferred to the automatic drip machine Gerald bought me for Christmas in 1994. The particular creak of the third stair from the bottom, which I could always hear when the kids came down in the morning. Marcus was the first one up, always. Even as a toddler, he was an early riser, padding down to the kitchen in his footy pajamas to stand at my knee while I made oatmeal, watching everything I did with those wide brown eyes he had inherited from Gerald's side. Renata was the opposite, a negotiator of extra minutes, an architect of reasons why 5 more wasn't unreasonable. Claire fell somewhere in between, the middle child in temperament as much as birth order, adaptable, observant, the one who watched everyone else and drew her own quiet conclusions. I raised those 3 children with a ferocity of attention that was, I now understand, also a kind of displacement. I poured into them everything that had nowhere else to go. Every ambition I had set aside, every curiosity I hadn't pursued, every version of myself I hadn't become. I channeled all of it into being their mother. And I was good at it. I want to say that plainly and without apology. I was a genuinely good mother. I was present and attentive and imaginative about it. We read together and cooked together and argued about homework and drove 1,000,000 miles to 1,000,000 practices and performances. And I knew my children, really knew them, in the specific and irreplaceable way that only comes from being there, every ordinary Tuesday, decade after decade. Gerald was a good father in the way that fathers of his generation and temperament often were, present and supportive and willing, but not primary. He coached Marcus's Little League team for 2 seasons in the early 90s. He took Renata to her first day of college at Ohio State in 1901. She was so nervous she forgot her pillow, and Gerald drove 45 minutes back to campus to deliver it. He built a bookshelf for Claire's bedroom when she was 12, and it was crooked, and she loved it anyway, and so did he. We were real. I need you to understand that. Our family was a real family with real love moving through it. Whatever else was true, that was also true. Renata married a man named Kevin Ostrowski in 2006, a mechanical engineer she had met at Ohio State, quiet and solid in the way that good Midwestern men often are, devoted to her in a way that made my heart settle. They moved to Columbus. Marcus had a rougher path. A broken engagement in his late 20s, a period of unhappiness he didn't talk about directly, but that I could feel across phone calls the way you can feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. He eventually found his footing in Cleveland, working in logistics, and by his mid-30s he seemed genuinely happy in a way I was grateful to witness. Claire became a nurse, which surprised no one who had watched her quiet, watchful intelligence develop over 3 decades. She settled in Akron with her partner Diane, and they had a home I loved to visit, full of plants and good cooking smells, and 2 rescue dogs named Franklin and Roosevelt. By 2011, all 3 children were established in their own lives. Gerald and I were in our early 50s, living in the colonial on Maple Crest that we now owned outright, with more space than we needed, and a quietness to the days that I was still learning to inhabit. The empty nest had arrived not with a crash, but with a slow, pervasive settling, like a house adjusting to a change in temperature. The business trips continued. They had continued through everything, through the children growing up, through Gerald's various promotions, an eventual transition from the savings and loan to a private wealth management firm in 2003, through my father's death and my mother's slow decline into the assisted living facility in Millhaven that she entered in 2009. Once every 6 to 8 weeks, 3 days, a rotation of plausible cities. I had long since stopped registering them as notable. They were simply part of the calendar, the way oil changes and dentist appointments are part of a calendar. Gerald traveled for work. I stayed home. He came back. Life continued. There was one evening, a Tuesday in February of 2009, a date I did not mark at the time but can now triangulate with some precision, when something shifted almost imperceptibly. Gerald came home from a business trip, and he was himself in every visible way. Same greeting at the door, same overnight bag set by the stairs, same question about what I'd made for dinner. But there was a moment, just one, when he set his phone face down on the kitchen counter with a speed and deliberateness that was a hair's breadth outside his normal casual rhythm. I noticed it. I filed it in the category of things I noticed but did not pursue, and I poured the soup. That category had more items in it than I ever admitted to myself. Not many. Gerald was extraordinarily careful, and I was, if I am being ruthlessly honest, extraordinarily skilled at not pushing on doors I was afraid to open. But there were items. Enough, in retrospect, to constitute a story. And it is time to tell that story fully. The first real sign that I can name with clarity, looking back with the eyes of someone who now knows everything, came in the spring of 1998. It was a Saturday morning in May, warm enough that I had the kitchen windows open, and I was doing the monthly bookkeeping, We always did our household budget on paper, in a green ledger I bought in bulk from the office supply store, because Gerald said paper felt more real than a computer screen for money matters, a position I found reasonable and never questioned. I was going through the bank statements, matching entries to my own records the way I always did, when I found a withdrawal from our joint savings account that I didn't have a corresponding record for. $340 taken from an ATM in Zanesville, Ohio, on a Wednesday in March when Gerald had been on a business trip to Columbus. Now, Zanesville is not on the way to Columbus. Zanesville is about 50 miles east of Columbus, in the opposite direction from anything related to Gerald's work territory. I knew this because we had driven through Zanesville once, years before, on the way to visit a college friend of mine in Morgantown, West Virginia. I sat with that bank entry for a full 2 minutes, which is a long time to sit with something you're afraid to investigate. The kitchen smelled like the lilac bush outside the window, which bloomed every May with a sweetness so thick it was almost edible. The percolator had gone quiet. The house was still because Renata and Marcus were at soccer practice and Claire was at a friend's house. It was just me and that number, 340. Years, Zanesville ATM, a Wednesday in March. Then I wrote in my ledger, Gerald, Misk, travel expense. And I closed the book. And I went to make a fresh pot of coffee. I told myself he had stopped for gas, perhaps gotten a bit off track. I told myself there were perfectly reasonable explanations. I told myself that marriages built on suspicion over a $340 withdrawal were not marriages I wanted to be part of. And all of those things were true, in their way. The telling detail is what I did not tell myself. I did not tell myself there was nothing to wonder about. I knew there was something to wonder about. I simply chose, with great conscious deliberateness, not to wonder. I think about that woman in the kitchen with the lilac smell and the green ledger, and I want to go back and sit across from her at that table and say, "You are not stupid. You are not weak. You are a woman who was trained, from girlhood, to accommodate rather than confront. And you are about to spend 15 more years not confronting, and it is going to cost you more than you can currently imagine." But she would not have listened. I know that because I know her. And I know how thoroughly she had learned that some doors are better left closed. The second sign came in the summer of 2002. This one was harder to rationalize, and I think about how I managed it with a kind of reluctant admiration for the architecture of my own denial. Gerald had a work phone, a company cell phone that the wealth management firm had issued him when he joined in 2003. So the one I'm about to describe was still the personal cell phone he'd had since 1999. This was July of 2002, before smartphones, back when cell phones were just phones, and he kept his clip to his belt in the way that men of his generation wore them, as a kind of badge of contemporary efficiency. He had left it on the bathroom counter when he went downstairs to watch the evening news. I was not snooping. I was not looking. I was using the bathroom, and the phone was there, and when I walked past it, the screen lit up with an incoming text message. The name in the preview was just a first name, no last name. That in itself might not have meant anything. But the name was Cora, and the message visible in the preview before it faded was, "Kids miss you. When are you back?" I stood in the bathroom for what felt like a very long time. I could hear the television downstairs, the familiar cadence of the evening news anchor. The bathroom tile was cold under my bare feet. The phone screen had gone dark. Kids, plural. Miss you. I picked up the phone. I set it back down. I picked it up again. I stood with it in my hand for 30 seconds, and then I put it precisely back where it had been, with the same edge against the same part of the counter. And I went downstairs and sat in the armchair across from Gerald and watched the last 10 minutes of the news with him. I did not mention Cora. I did not mention the text. I did not mention any of it. What I told myself, what I remember clearly telling myself, was that Cora was probably a colleague's name, that kids might mean co-workers in some context I didn't understand, that I had no business reading his private messages, and therefore had no business forming conclusions from them. And beneath all of that clean, reasonable language, in a space so quiet and so deep it barely registered as thought, "Do not open this. You are not ready for what is behind it." The third sign arrived in 2004, and this one involved my friend Harriet Kowalczyk, who had been my closest friend in Millhaven since we were both young mothers navigating the PTA at Millhaven Elementary in the late 80s. Harriet was not the kind of woman who said things carelessly. She was precise and measured, and had the particular wisdom of someone who had seen a great deal without broadcasting it. We were having lunch at the Millhaven Diner. We did this every third Thursday, a tradition that had survived 20 years and 2 relocations, and Harriet's knee surgery. When she looked at me across her chicken salad and said, with a deliberateness that I recognized as something she had been working up to, "I need to ask you something, and I need you not to get your back up before I finish." I told her to go ahead. She asked me if Gerald and I were doing all right. I said we were fine. She looked at me for a moment, that long, searching look that only old friends can give you. And then she said she had seen Gerald the previous weekend at the Crossroads Mall in Newark, Ohio. Gerald had told me he was in Dayton that weekend for a Saturday seminar. Newark, Ohio, is approximately the same distance from Millhaven as Zanesville. It is also not anywhere near Dayton. What Harriet had seen, specifically, was Gerald coming out of a children's clothing store at the mall, carrying a large bag and getting into his car. Alone, she said. But the children's clothing store detail sat in me like a stone. I told Harriet that Gerald sometimes ran personal errands on business trips, that he might have been buying something for a colleague's baby, that she must have misread the store sign. I watched my own mouth produce these explanations with something close to clinical detachment. Harriet watched me produce them too. Then she said very quietly, "Okay, if you ever need to talk, I'm here." She never brought it up again. We continued our every third Thursday lunches for another decade, and I loved her for both things equally, for asking and for letting me not answer. The fourth sign came in the winter of 2007, and this one I almost cannot talk about without the kind of anger that makes my hands shake even now. So I am going to take a breath and tell it plainly. Gerald had a study at the back of the house, a room that had been the formal dining room in the house's original layout that we had converted when we did the renovation in 2001. He kept his work files there, his personal financial documents, the kind of paperwork that accumulates in the life of a man who manages money for a living and does some of the same for his own household. I never had a reason to go into his study, particularly. We were not those kinds of spouses, the ones who share every drawer, every inbox. We had what I would have called a comfortable privacy, a reasonable expectation that some spaces were his and some were mine. But on a December evening in 2007, I was looking for the extended warranty documentation for the dishwasher, which had abruptly stopped draining that afternoon. I had checked the kitchen drawer where I kept appliance manuals and it wasn't there. And Gerald was away on a business trip, Columbus, that week. So I went into his study to look in the filing cabinet where he kept household documents. The filing cabinet was locked. That was the new thing. I had been in that cabinet before, years earlier, looking for our tax returns when I needed them for a refinancing application. The cabinet had not been locked then. It was locked now. I stood in the doorway of the study for a moment, with the kitchen light behind me and the room in shadow, and I noticed something else. There were file folders on the desk, not in the cabinet, and one of them was labeled in Gerald's handwriting with a name. Not a client name, not a work category. A first name and a last name, written in Gerald's neat, deliberate cursive, the same handwriting I had watched him use on birthday cards and checks and grocery lists for 27 years. The folder was closed. I could not see its contents from the doorway. I did not enter the room. I turned around, found the dishwasher warranty in the kitchen utility drawer where it had apparently been all along, and called the appliance repair line. But I had seen the name. I had read it clearly in the moment before I turned around, and it had gone into that deep, silent place where I stored things I was not ready to know. And even though I would not let myself consciously sit with it or examine it, somewhere in the architecture of what I knew and didn't know, a new room had been built. The fifth sign is the one that, when I finally told my daughter Renata the full story years later, made her cover her mouth with both hands and go very still. It is the one that, even now, catches in my throat a little. Christmas of 2010. All 3 children were home, Renata and Kevin, Marcus, Claire and Diane. And we were doing what we always did. The tree, the stockings, Mama Vera's buttercake recipe that I made every year now that she was no longer able to. The particular chaos of 5 adults in a house that had once been full and was now pleasantly full again for a few days. Gerald was in a better mood than I had seen him in months. Expansive, laughing easily, engaged with everyone in a way that made the house feel lit up from within. Late on Christmas evening, after dinner and the dishes, and when everyone had drifted into their own comfortable corners, Gerald went to the study and came back with a gift he had wrapped separately from the others, a small package, not under the tree, extracted from somewhere I hadn't seen. He gave it to me with a look I can only describe as tender. Inside was a bracelet, not expensive, not the kind of thing that would cause comment, but delicate and clearly chosen with care. A simple gold chain with a small charm in the shape of a bird. A cardinal. I loved it immediately. I put it on immediately. I wore it every day for 3 years. What I did not know, and would not know until much later, was that the boutique where Gerald had purchased it, a small gift shop I had never heard of in a town I barely knew, was approximately 4 miles from a house where another woman was waking up on Christmas morning with her own children. His other children. He had purchased my gift in the town where he kept his other family. The 6th sign came in the spring of 2013, and it was the one I came closest to actually following up on. It was also the one that, had I pursued it, would have saved me 2 additional years of not knowing. The cell phone provider sent a paper bill that month. They usually sent ours electronically, but something had changed in their system and a paper bill arrived. Gerald was already at work when the mail came. I brought the bill in with the rest of the mail without particularly thinking about it, set it on the kitchen table, and then, in the act of sorting the stack, found myself holding it and not immediately putting it down. The bill listed calls and texts, not content, just records. Numbers called, duration, frequency. I was not, by this point, looking for anything. I want to be honest about that. I was simply holding a piece of mail that happened to contain information, and my eye moved across it the way eyes do when they encounter a printed page. There was one number that appeared with a frequency that separated it from all others. Not a business number. I knew those. I had written them down in my address book over the years. Not the children's numbers, which I also knew by heart. This was a number I didn't recognize. With an area code I had to think about for a moment before I placed it. 740. Southeastern Ohio. The same general region as Zanesville, as Newark. This number appeared on the bill 37 times in 1 month. Calls ranging from 2 minutes to 45 minutes. Texts I couldn't see the content of, but could count. 37 contacts in 30 days, an average of more than once per day. I went to the kitchen drawer, where I kept the notepad, and I wrote the number down. I wrote it on the notepad, and I stared at it, and I thought, clearly and without any self-deception at all, that this number almost certainly belonged to someone who was a significant presence in Gerald's life. Someone he spoke to every single day. Someone whose calls were not made in front of me. Then I folded the paper in half, put it in the drawer under the notepad, and did not take it out for the next 2 years. I am not going to analyze that for you right now, because I think the facts speak for themselves, and I think anyone who has ever stood at the edge of a terrible truth and chosen to step back knows exactly why I put that paper in the drawer. Knowledge is not just power. Knowledge is also the end of a life you have built. And I was not, at that moment, ready for my life to end. The 7th sign was a conversation that was not quite a conversation. Gerald and I had a marriage that was, in the years after the children left, quietly comfortable in the way that long marriages can be. Not passionate, not troubled, not particularly deep, but not unkind. We were two people who knew each other's rhythms thoroughly enough to navigate the days without friction. We had dinner together most evenings. We watched television together, walked together on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, talked about the children and the house and the news with a mild, genuine interest. But in 2014, over a period of several months, Gerald began waking in the night. Not dramatically, not the gasping, disoriented waking of a nightmare. More the quiet, deliberate waking of someone who has something on their mind that won't let them sleep. I would feel him leave the bed, hear the faint sound of him in the study with the door closed, hear him come back an hour or two later. I asked him once if everything was all right. He said he was fine, that he just had some work things he was thinking through, that there was a client situation that required attention. He said it easily and completely, the way he said most things, without evident deception, without any signal I could identify as a tell. I accepted it. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The eighth and final sign, the one that closed the chapter of not knowing and opened the chapter of everything that came after, arrived in October of 2015. Gerald came home from a business trip, a Thursday evening, 3 days in Columbus as usual. He was quiet in a way that was slightly different from his normal post-travel quiet. He ate dinner with focused attention, as if eating were a task requiring concentration. He helped clear the table, which he usually did, and then he said he was tired and was going to turn in early. At 10 o'clock that night, I went upstairs and Gerald was not asleep. He was lying in the dark with his eyes open and his arms at his sides, perfectly still, in the posture of someone who is not resting, but waiting. I stood in the doorway and looked at him, and something in the quality of that stillness moved through me like cold water. "Gerald," I said, "what's going on?" He turned his head and looked at me, and in the dim light from the hallway, for just a fraction of a second, less than a breath, I saw something cross his face that I had never seen there before. Something that looked, unmistakably, like guilt. Then it was gone. He said he was fine, tired, thinking about a client. Go to sleep, Dot. I went to sleep, but something had shifted in me, in that doorway, looking at my husband's face in the dark. The accumulated weight of 34 years of signs had reached some invisible tipping point, and for the first time, the very first time, I did not step back from the door. For the first time, something in me said, enough. I did not act immediately. I want to be accurate about the timeline because it matters. Between that night in October of 2015 and the day I actually began to investigate, there were approximately 3 weeks during which I simply sat with the decision to know, the way you sit with a doctor's appointment you've made but haven't yet attended. The appointment exists. The knowledge will arrive. But for now, there is a space between the decision and the action, and you inhabit it with a particular, suspended kind of dread. In those 3 weeks, I watched Gerald with different eyes. Not dramatically different. I was careful not to let anything in my behavior change, because I did not want to warn him that my internal landscape had altered. But I watched him with eyes that were no longer choosing not to see, and what I saw, now that I was looking without the buffer of willed blindness, was the extraordinary architecture of a secret. The work phone and the personal phone, both always in his possession, both always managed with a discipline I now recognized as defensive rather than simply habitual. The way he always took phone calls in the study or on the back porch, never in the kitchen or the living room. The way the business trips were always announced the same way. Calm, matter-of-fact, scheduled, never with the slight anticipatory energy a person shows when they're going somewhere they're looking forward to, and never with the slight reluctance a person shows when travel is genuinely for work. They were performed with a practiced neutrality that I now understood was the result of 34 years of refinement. The way he had, over the years, gradually shifted more of our household finances from our joint account to accounts I had minimal visibility into, not removed my access, never anything so overt, but structured things so that the joint account was largely for utilities and groceries, while investments, savings, and a second checking account were in his name alone. This had happened incrementally, so slowly that I had never noticed the drift. Now I noticed all at once. I began, quietly, to take stock of what I knew about our finances. This was more difficult than it should have been for a woman who had been married to a man for 34 years, and that difficulty was itself a revelation. I did not know the full balance of Gerald's individual accounts. I did not have the login information for the brokerage account he had opened in 2004. I did not know the details of his life insurance policies. I knew our joint account intimately. I knew the mortgage payment and the utility costs and the grocery budget with the precision of someone who had managed them for decades. But the larger financial picture, the savings, the investments, the retirement accounts, these were Gerald's domain, and I had let them be. That realization, the realization that I had been systematically, if quietly, kept at a distance from the full picture of our financial life, landed on me on a Wednesday morning in November with a weight that took my breath. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one I had eaten at for 31 years, and I let myself feel, for the first time, the full extent of what I was sitting in the middle of. Then I got up and drove to the public library in Millhaven, where I knew the computers had private browsing, and where the librarian, a young woman named Ashley, who had helped me find reference books for years, would not think anything of an older woman spending an hour at a terminal. I searched for private investigators in our area. I want to describe that moment with the precision it deserves because it was the moment the story changed. I was 60 years old. I was sitting in the Millhaven Public Library on a Tuesday morning, wearing my good wool coat and my reading glasses, and I was typing search terms into a library computer like a woman who was finally, 34 years late, ready to open a door. My hands did not shake. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake. Instead, they were very steady, very deliberate, and I thought of my mother's clean floors, her moral statement about the condition of one's house, and I thought, all right, Vera, let's see how the foundation holds. I found a private investigation firm in Columbus, Hartley and Associates, a name I found in the professional investigators section of a referral directory, with reviews that described them as discreet, thorough, and experienced in marital cases. I wrote down the phone number with the same steadiness in my hand. I drove home. I called from the home phone, which Gerald would never check while he was at work. The woman who answered was named Patricia, and she had the particular warmth with efficiency of someone who spoke to frightened, uncertain people all day and had learned how to be kind without being slow about it. She asked me some preliminary questions. She told me the rates. She explained what they could and couldn't do. She asked if I had any specific information, locations, dates, patterns, that might help focus the investigation. I told her about the 3-day trips to Columbus. I told her about the 740 area code phone number I had written on a notepad 2 years earlier and never followed up on. I told her about the locked filing cabinet and the children's clothing store in Newark, and the name I had seen on the folder in the study, though I had spent so long not letting myself consciously examine it that I was not entirely certain I was remembering it correctly. Patricia listened without interruption. When I finished, there was a pause of a few seconds, and then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, I think we have enough to start. Can we schedule a consultation for this week?" We scheduled it for Thursday. Gerald would be in Columbus, a 3-day trip, as a matter of fact, beginning that very Wednesday morning. I told Patricia I could come in Thursday at 10. If you're still here with me, if you've been walking through this whole story so far, I need to stop for just a moment because I know some of you are feeling this in your own chests right now. Some of you have been at that library computer. Some of you are right now, this very moment, sitting with a green ledger and a number you've been afraid to follow. If this story is reaching something in you, please hit that like button for me. It takes 1 second, and it tells the channel that these real, honest stories matter. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you're thinking, what you felt when you heard about that folded piece of paper in the drawer. This channel grows because of every single one of you, and I see you. The moment of discovery, the actual, concrete, undeniable moment, did not come from the private investigator, though what Hartley and Associates confirmed was more extensive and more devastating than anything I had prepared myself for. It came first from the paper trail. Patricia at Hartley and Associates had suggested, in our Thursday consultation, that I spend some time looking at the financial documents I could access. Not to tamper with anything, not to do anything illegal, simply to look at what was mine to look at within our joint financial life, and to create a record of what I found. She had said this matter-of-factly, in the same tone she used for everything, but I had heard in it what she was not quite saying, that in a divorce proceeding, and she was gently, professionally positioning me to think about this possibility. Documentation of financial patterns created before the separation is invaluable. I spent the Friday after our consultation in the kitchen with every paper document in the joint household files that I could access. Bank statements from the joint account going back 5 years, the mortgage documents, the jointly filed tax returns, which were my right to access as a co-filer, utility records, insurance policies, or the ones I could find. The tax returns were the door. Gerald was meticulous about his personal taxes, handled by an accountant in Columbus he had used for 20 years. We filed jointly, and I signed the return every April without examining it particularly closely, because it had been Gerald's domain and the refund went into the joint account, and I had never had reason to look more carefully. I looked more carefully now. The return was not, in itself, illegal. Gerald was not a tax criminal, but it contained a Schedule A, itemized deductions, that included, under the heading of charitable contributions, donations to a 501c3 organization I had never heard of, a community foundation in a small city in southeastern Ohio in Muskingum County, which is the county that contains Zanesville. The address of the community foundation was in a city called Roseville, Ohio, population approximately 2,000, 47 miles from Millhaven. I wrote down Roseville, Ohio. Then I drove back to the public library. I had decided that the library's computers were safer than my home computer, though in retrospect I recognized this was perhaps excessive caution, since Gerald had no reason to review my search history. And I searched for Roseville, Ohio. And then, with hands that, for the first time in this entire story, did begin to tremble slightly, I searched for the name I had seen on the folder in Gerald's study. The name I had read and put away in the deep place and told myself I hadn't really seen or hadn't really known what it meant. The name was Deborah Tanner. Roseville, Ohio, had a small local newspaper, the Muskingum County Weekly, with a limited online archive going back to 2008. I searched for Deborah Tanner in the archive. She appeared in a community events section from 2012 at a school fundraiser for Roseville Elementary. She was identified as a parent volunteer. The caption beneath the small photograph listed her name and, in parentheses, the names of her children who attended Roseville Elementary: Caleb, age 9, and Lily, age 7. In 2012, Caleb had been 9 years old. That meant he had been born in approximately 2003. In 2012, Lily had been 7 years old. That meant she had been born in approximately 2005. I sat at the library computer and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was very simple and very clear. And when I finished doing it, I sat for a moment and looked at the arithmetic, and then I gathered my coat and my bag, and I walked out of the library into the November air of Millhaven, Ohio, where the bare trees along the main street stood in the gray light like witnesses, and I stood on the sidewalk, and I breathed in and out, and in and out. I had been right. I had known, in that deep and voiceless place, for a long time. Perhaps since Harriet's lunch. Perhaps since the bathroom and the phone and the name Cora, because Cora might have been a diminutive or a middle name, or a name she used for certain people in her life. Perhaps since the ATM withdrawal in Zanesville in 1998. Perhaps since the very beginning, in some cellular, animal way that I will never be able to articulate and do not need to. I had 2 children in that archive photograph. My husband had 2 more children in Roseville, Ohio. I called Patricia at Hartley & Associates from the sidewalk outside the library. What the private investigators confirmed over the following 6 weeks was comprehensive. I say this not to dwell on the pain of it, but because the facts matter. And because I think women who are reading the first pages of a story like mine deserve to know what the middle pages can look like before they decide whether to keep reading. Gerald Wayne Calloway had been maintaining a second household in Roseville, Ohio, since approximately 2002. The woman there was Deborah Ann Tanner, 44 years old at the time of the investigation, nearly 20 years younger than me, a woman who worked part-time as a medical billing specialist and who, the investigator's report made clear, appeared to believe she was in a committed relationship with a man who traveled extensively for work and who spent as much time with her and their children as his schedule allowed. Their children. Caleb James Calloway, because she had given them his last name, which itself told a story, who was 12 in 2015. And Lily Grace Calloway, who was 10. 2 children who called my husband their father. 2 children who had been taken to the Columbus Zoo, I imagined, and given stuffed animals. 2 children for whom Gerald had been in the children's clothing store at Crossroads Mall in Newark, carrying a large bag. The community foundation in Muskingum County that appeared on our joint tax return as a charitable contribution was a mechanism. I don't know who had arranged it, whether Gerald had done it himself or with professional assistance, but it was a mechanism for moving money into an account that Deborah had access to. The charitable contribution deduction was fraudulent, which meant that every joint tax return we had filed since 2002 contained a fraudulent entry that I had signed. I was not angry about the signing. I understood immediately that this had been done deliberately to implicate me in a paper trail, to make me complicit in his deception in a way that gave him leverage. I noted it. I put it in my file. The phone number with the 740 area code that I had written on the notepad in 2013 and put in the kitchen drawer was, as I had known it would be, Deborah Tanner's number. The investigators also confirmed, in a section of the report I read 3 times before I fully absorbed it, that Deborah Tanner did not appear to know that Gerald was married. The investigators had done their work carefully and professionally, and their assessment, based on the evidence they had gathered, was that she had been deceived as thoroughly as I had. That information changed everything about how I thought about Deborah. It did not make the situation less painful, but it removed Deborah from the category of enemy and placed her, unmistakably and uncomfortably, in the category of victim, a woman who was going to be just as destroyed by the truth as I was, perhaps more so, because she had 2 children whose entire conception of their family was about to be dismantled. I sat with the investigators' full report for a long, long time. I sat with it through the end of November and through December, which had the surreal quality of a stage production I was performing in while simultaneously watching from a great distance. Gerald was home for the holidays. The children came, Renata and Kevin, Marcus, Claire, and Diane. I made the butter cake. Gerald was warm and present and laughed his full-room laugh, and I watched him the whole time with a new and clear and heartbroken vision that I kept entirely off my face. On Christmas morning, he gave me a pair of small pearl earrings. I thanked him. I put them on. I wore them through the day. When everyone had gone home and Gerald was asleep on the night of the 26th, I went to the kitchen and I opened the drawer under the notepad, and I took out the folded piece of paper with the phone number on it, and I held it for a moment, and then I put it in my pocket, and I sat down at the table and I let myself cry. Quietly, thoroughly, the way you cry when you are not crying for yourself alone, but for all the versions of yourself you are about to leave behind. Then I dried my face, made a cup of tea, and began making my plan. Let me be very honest about the planning period. The investigators had done their part. They had given me information, real, documented, confirmed information. And now what I did with it was entirely mine to decide. And there was a version of this story, a version I am certain many people would have chosen, where I confronted Gerald immediately, told him I knew everything, demanded he leave. I chose not to do that. And I chose not to do it for reasons that were both practical and strategic, because I had spent my entire adult life being good at managing the practical, and I was not about to abandon that competence at the moment I needed it most. The first practical consideration was financial. I was 60 years old. I had not been employed outside the home since 1983. My Social Security benefits, based on my own work history alone, would be minimal. In Ohio, I was entitled to a share of marital assets, but only if I knew what the marital assets were, and Gerald had structured our finances so that my knowledge was carefully limited. Before I could make any move, I needed a complete and accurate picture of what existed to be divided. I hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Brenda Kasich, no relation to the governor, and she was 62 years old, the same age as me, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck and a manner that reminded me of my fifth-grade teacher in the best possible way. Absolutely no nonsense, but also not unkind. She charged by the hour. I paid her from a personal savings account, a small one, opened in my name alone back in 1987 for what I had always called my rainy day money, a habit my mother had drilled into me and that I had maintained quietly for nearly 30 years without Gerald knowing the full balance. Now I was grateful for that habit in a way I had never anticipated. Brenda spent 3 weeks going through every document I could legally access. She found the brokerage account, the value of which was considerably higher than I had imagined. Gerald had been a careful investor for decades, and the account had grown substantially. She found a second life insurance policy I hadn't known existed. She found evidence of what she called irregular transfers, regular patterned movements of money out of our joint savings account and into an account in Gerald's name alone over a period of years that appeared to follow no logical investment pattern. Some of that money, she explained, had almost certainly gone to Roseville. The second consideration was legal. I needed an attorney before I moved, not after. I called 3 family law attorneys and interviewed each one by phone before selecting Maureen Grady, a partner at a Columbus firm who had 20 years of experience in complex marital asset cases and who, when I gave her the basic outline of my situation, said very calmly, "Mrs. Calloway, you've done this exactly right. You have documentation. You have an investigator's report, and you have a forensic accountant. Let's talk about next steps." Maureen told me what I needed to know about Ohio marital property law. She explained what equitable distribution meant in practice, what I could expect in terms of spousal support given the length of the marriage and my lack of independent income, and what leverage the fraudulent tax filings might provide. She was careful, as a matter of professional ethics, not to advise me to use that fraudulent tax filing issue in a punitive way, but she made sure I understood that it existed and that it had weight. The third consideration, and this was the one that took the most time, the most quiet, the most sitting alone with myself in the early morning hours when the house was still and the coffee was hot, was what to do about Deborah Tanner and her children. I wrestled with this for weeks. I am not going to pretend otherwise. The part of me that was furious and wounded wanted nothing to do with Deborah Tanner. She was living in a house that was, in some functional sense, being subsidized by the life Gerald and I had built together. Her children shared my husband's name. Whatever her culpability or lack of it, her existence represented the most profound betrayal I had ever experienced. But I kept coming back to what the investigators had concluded, that she did not know, that she was deceived, that she had built her life on the same false foundation as mine, and that her children, 2 children who were 12 and 10 years old, were entirely innocent of everything. I thought about Caleb and Lily Calloway a great deal. I thought about what it meant to be a child whose father was a man like Gerald, who was apparently capable of profound warmth and engagement, and whose deception did not cancel out the reality of his love for his children. I thought about what it would mean for those children when the truth arrived, as it would have to arrive, and how much damage could be done or not done depending on how I handled this. In the end, I made 2 decisions that I still, to this day, believe were the right ones. The first decision was that before Gerald received any legal papers, before anything was filed or served or made official, I would find a way to make sure Deborah Tanner knew the truth. Not to hurt her, I want to be clear about that, because my motives matter to me. But because she deserved the truth about the man she was raising children with, and because if the truth arrived through Gerald's attorney, rather than from a source who had any shred of compassion in it, it would be so much more devastating for her and for those kids. The second decision was that I would not be in the house when Gerald was served. I had spoken to Maureen, and she had agreed that physically removing myself was both wise and entirely within my rights. I would be somewhere else, somewhere specific, somewhere I had planned, and Gerald would receive the papers, and then we would see what kind of man he really was when the architecture came down. I began the practical preparations in January of 2016. I want to take you through them with the precision they deserve, because there is a kind of power in the specifics, and I think women who are planning their own escape from untenable situations deserve to see what the specifics look like. I opened a new bank account at a different institution from any Gerald and I used, First Federal Savings in the county seat, where I had no established relationship that might generate conversation. I began, modestly but consistently, moving money from my personal savings into this new account. I made no large withdrawals that might trigger a pattern, just small, regular transfers that looked like nothing in particular. I called Claire and told her what I knew. I did this on a Tuesday morning in January when Gerald was at work, from the kitchen phone, and I told her everything, the full story, the investigator's report, Deborah Tanner, the children, the money. Claire was quiet for the entire time I spoke, and when I finished, she said, "Mom, just that, and then, what do you need? Not what are you going to do, not are you sure? Not wait and talk to him first. What do you need?" Claire drove up from Akron the following weekend and stayed for 3 days. She helped me organize my documents, the investigator's report, Brenda's forensic accounting work, copies of the tax returns, the bank records, into a file that I kept at Claire's house in Akron, not in my home, where Gerald could access it. She helped me think through the logistics. She sat with me in the evenings and did not try to tell me how to feel, which was the greatest gift she could have given me. I told Marcus and Renata separately in February. These were the hardest conversations, harder in some ways than anything else that happened, because watching your children's faces as you dismantle the story of their family is a particular kind of grief that I don't have adequate words for. Marcus was angry in the combustible, protective way of grown sons, and I had to specifically and firmly ask him not to call his father until I gave the word. Renata cried and then stopped crying and asked the same question Claire had asked, "What do you need?" I told all 3 of them what I needed: time, discretion, and trust. They gave me all 3. Harriet Kowalczyk, my oldest friend, who had asked me the question I hadn't answered at the diner 12 years earlier, I told in March. She came over on a Wednesday afternoon when Gerald was at work, and I made coffee and told her everything. And at the end she looked at me for a long moment and said, "I have been waiting 12 years to help you." Then she rolled up her sleeves and asked me what she could do. What Harriet could do, it turned out, was remarkable. Harriet had a sister in Columbus, Sandra, who ran a small property management company. Sandra, through Harriet, found me a one-bedroom apartment in a quiet Columbus neighborhood, available April 1st, with a month-to-month lease and a landlord who was discreet about tenants' circumstances. The apartment was clean and bright and utterly unknown to Gerald, and it was mine to move into whenever I was ready. I was ready in March. On the 3rd of March, while Gerald was at work, I moved the things that were mine and only mine: my clothing, my books, my personal papers, my mother's butter cake recipe written in Vera's handwriting on a card I kept in the kitchen drawer, my photographs, my grandmother's quilt, into Claire's car, which she had driven up the night before, and then into a storage unit I had rented in Columbus under my own name. I left behind everything that was ours together, because in the division of things, those would be dealt with by Maureen and the process she had set in motion. I left the pearl earrings Gerald had given me on Christmas Day. I left the cardinal bracelet, which I had worn every day for 3 years without knowing it had been purchased in the same town where his other family lived. I left it deliberately, and with a clarity that I found in the moment of leaving it, not painful, but simply precise. I left a note that said, "Gerald, my attorney's name is Maureen Grady. She will be in touch. 4 words and a name. 34 years and 4 words and a name." The day Maureen's office served Gerald was a Thursday in March 2016. I know the exact time, 11:14 in the morning, because Maureen had arranged for process service at the wealth management firm's office, and her paralegal called to confirm service at 11:20. I was at Harriet's house when the call came. Harriet and I were sitting at her kitchen table with coffee, real percolated coffee because Harriet also preferred it to the drip machine. And when my phone rang, I answered it, and the paralegal said, "Mrs. Calloway, he's been served." And I said, "Thank you," and I put the phone down and Harriet refilled my cup. Gerald called my cell phone 9 times between 11:30 and 2 in the afternoon. I did not answer. He called Claire, who picked up and told him, calmly and without elaboration, that she was aware of the situation and that all communication should go through my attorney. He called Marcus, who did not pick up. He called Renata, who picked up and said essentially the same thing Claire had said. And then, I heard this later, from Renata. She said one additional thing before she ended the call. She said, "Dad, I love you, but you need to understand what you've done." Gerald called Maureen's office at 2:15. Maureen took the call and listened to whatever he had to say, and then she said, in the level professional tone she used for everything, "Mr. Calloway, I'll be happy to discuss this with your attorney. Do you have representation yet?" He did not yet have representation. He got it within a week. A family law attorney out of Columbus who turned out to be quite competent, which I was glad of, because I wanted this process to be conducted with professional precision on both sides. I wanted no ambiguities. The details of the divorce itself took 18 months to resolve, and I am not going to spend a great deal of time on the legal specifics, both because they were complex and because they are not, finally, the most important part of this story. What I will say is that Maureen was extraordinary, that Brenda's forensic accounting was instrumental, and that in the end, the settlement was equitable in a way that acknowledged both the length of the marriage and the nature of the deception. I received my share of the marital assets, including a portion of the brokerage account that I had not known existed until Brenda found it. I received spousal support. I received the house on Maple Crest Drive, which I later sold, using the proceeds to purchase a small, lovely condominium in Columbus near Claire. There was one element of the settlement that was neither legal nor financial. It was personal, and it was something I requested specifically through Maureen. I asked that Gerald arrange, through whatever means he chose, for Deborah Tanner to be told the full truth about his marital status before the divorce was finalized. Maureen presented this as a personal request, not a legal requirement. Gerald's attorney conveyed it, and approximately 2 weeks after the request was made, I received a letter through Maureen's office, not from Deborah, but from Gerald's attorney confirming that Deborah had been informed and that she had ended the relationship. I do not know what Deborah Tanner felt in that moment. I have imagined it many times, and each time I imagine it, I feel a complicated, grieving kind of solidarity with a woman I have never met. We were both deceived by the same man. We both had to rebuild. The difference is that I had 34 years and she had 13. And I had the resources of an ended marriage to draw on while she had 2 children to support and a life she had constructed on a false premise. I did something, after the divorce was finalized, that I told only Claire about at the time. I made a contribution, a meaningful one, not large but real, to a children's education fund in Muskingum County. I made it anonymously. I cannot prove it went anywhere near Caleb and Lily Calloway. And perhaps it didn't. But I needed to do something for those children, and that was what I was able to do, and I am at peace with it. The first day in the Columbus apartment, I moved in on a Thursday, in April of 2016, the day after the service was confirmed and Gerald's calls had gone unanswered, had a quality I am not sure I can fully convey to anyone who hasn't experienced a similar threshold. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a brick building near Clintonville, with 2 east-facing windows that caught the morning light. It had hardwood floors and a galley kitchen and a closet that was entirely mine. It was approximately 1/4 the size of the house on Maple Crest Drive, and it was the most spacious thing I had ever inhabited. I set my grandmother's quilt on the bed. I put my books on the shelf I had bought flat-packed and assembled myself on the living room floor that first evening, with a glass of wine and a level of satisfaction I have rarely matched since. I hung the photographs of my 3 children on the wall beside the kitchen door where I could see them from the sofa. I put a small percolator on the counter, a new one, purchased specifically for this apartment, the first kitchen appliance I had bought for myself in 30 years. That first morning, I made coffee and stood at the east window with the light coming in, and I drank the coffee and I looked at the street below. A quiet Columbus street with a bakery on the corner that was just opening, and a man walking a dog, and 2 college students on bicycles, and I felt something I had not felt in so long that it took me a moment to identify it. I felt like myself. Not a wife, not a mother in the active daily sense, not a homemaker, not a deceived woman, not a woman in the middle of a divorce proceeding, not a woman who had spent 34 years with a man who had 2 lives. Just Dorothea Briggs Calloway, 61 years old, standing at a window with a cup of coffee in her own apartment in the morning light. The reactions from the extended community in Millhaven were varied, as the reactions of small communities always are. There were people who were shocked, people who expressed sympathy with a fervor that made clear they had always suspected something. People who told me I was brave. People who told me I should have tried harder to save the marriage. One woman at church who told me, with apparent sincerity, that divorce was a tragedy for the whole community, as if Gerald's 33 years of deception were somehow a shared responsibility. My mother, who was 82 and living in the assisted care facility, and whose mind was not as sharp as it had been, listened to what I told her about the divorce, with the focused attention she could still manage for short periods, and when I finished, she patted my hand and said, "Vera always said you were the strong one." I treasured that for weeks. Harriet, predictably, was magnificent. She drove to Columbus twice a month that first year to have lunch with me, continuing our every 3rd Thursday tradition in a new city. She brought me casseroles, which I largely didn't need but deeply appreciated, and books she thought I'd like, and gossip from Millhaven, delivered with the dry precision that had always been one of her finest qualities. The children navigated the changed landscape with the particular resilience and creativity that I think is one of the remarkable things about adult children who love their parents. Not the unconditional love of childhood, which is beautiful but uncritical, but the chosen, clear-eyed love of grown people who know you as a person and decide, despite everything they know, to stay. They stayed. All 3 of them, completely. Gerald's relationship with the children was altered, and I want to be accurate about this rather than satisfying. It was not destroyed. Gerald was still their father. They were still his children. The adjustments they made to that relationship were their own to make, and I was careful, rigorously careful, not to direct or influence those adjustments. Whatever I felt about Gerald, my children's relationship with their father was theirs, not mine, and I kept that boundary with the same cleanliness I kept my floors. In the first year after the divorce was finalized, in the fall of 2017, I did something I had been wanting to do for a very long time and had never done. I enrolled in a community college course. Not a full degree program. I was 62 years old and I had no particular need for a credential. But I had always, quietly, wished I had continued my education past high school. And there was a single community college course being offered at Columbus State, a history course, specifically a course on women in 20th century America, that caught my eye in the catalog Claire had left on my kitchen table after a visit. I registered for the course on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my small kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of coffee cooling beside me. I paid for it myself, with my own money, and the quiet satisfaction of that transaction was out of all proportion to its practical significance. The course met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and I drove myself there in the used Honda Civic I had purchased after the Le Sabre finally gave up in the summer of 2017. And I sat in a classroom with people who were largely young enough to be my children, and I participated in discussions about women's labor history and suffrage, and the particular shapes that female courage takes across a century, and I found myself, consistently and gratefully, precisely where I needed to be. The professor, a woman named Dr. Elaine Winters, somewhere in her 50s, with the engaged and slightly impatient manner of someone who genuinely loves her subject and doesn't have time for people who don't, noticed me in the third class. Not in a way that was notable. She simply called on me when my hand was up, the way she called on everyone, and listened to what I said with that focused attention that the best teachers have. After the fourth class, she stopped me as I was gathering my things and said, "Mrs. Calloway, you have a very clear and analytical way of reading these situations. Have you studied history before?" I told her no. I told her I had worked as a receptionist before my marriage and had spent 30-some years keeping a household. She looked at me for a moment and said, "That's a great deal of organizational management and clearly a great deal of observation." I smiled at her and I said, "You have no idea. The personal rebuilding process was not linear, and I would be doing a disservice to anyone reading this if I made it seem as though there was a clean narrative arc from pain to wholeness. There were mornings in the Columbus apartment, particularly in the first year, and again in odd isolated moments in the second and third year, when I woke at 3 or 4 in the morning with a grief so physical it felt like illness. Not grief for Gerald himself exactly. I had done a great deal of my grieving for Gerald while I was still married to him, in all those years of not knowing that were also in some deep way years of knowing. What I grieved was the life, the assumption of continuity, the 34 years of shared context, of daily intimacy, of simply being known by someone in the specific and irreplaceable way that happens only with time. I grieved the sound of the third stair creaking under someone else's weight. I grieved the Sunday morning walks. I grieved, in one complicated and specific instance that I remember clearly, the sound of his laugh, not for his sake, but for the memory of a self who had loved that laugh without reservation. I let myself grieve. I want to say that plainly, because I think there is an expectation in stories like this one that the revelation should be a release, that knowing the truth should feel like freedom from the moment it arrives. And there were moments of that, real moments of genuine freedom and relief. But they coexisted with grief, and I let them coexist, and I think that was the right thing to do. I joined a book club in Clintonville in the spring of 2018, a Wednesday evening group that met in the back room of an independent bookstore called Pages, and that included 9 other women ranging in age from their 30s to their mid-70s, and that became, over the following years, one of the most genuinely sustaining communities I have ever been part of. These women did not know my history in the way that Millhaven knew it. They knew me as Dot Calloway, a woman who had moved to Columbus after a life elsewhere, who had opinions about historical fiction and an eye for the telling detail in a narrative and an occasionally dry wit that one of the younger members, a 35-year-old graphic designer named Fiona, told me was her favorite thing about the group. I learned to cook things I had never cooked before. This might sound trivial, but it wasn't. I had cooked for a family for 34 years, good, hearty, reliable cooking, the kind that makes a home feel inhabited and loved. But I had never cooked for myself, with no consideration except my own preference. I taught myself to make Thai basil chicken from a YouTube video. I made a Moroccan lamb stew from a cookbook Claire gave me for Christmas. I made soufflés, which I had always been afraid to attempt, and failed the first 2 times with something close to glee, and succeeded on the 3rd try with the kind of disproportionate pride that is one of the genuine pleasures of learning something new. I planted a container garden on the small balcony of the apartment, tomatoes, basil, mint, a rose bush in a pot that the Columbus summer was not particularly enthusiastic about, but that persisted stubbornly and produced 3 blooms in its 2nd year, which I felt was a personality alignment I could appreciate. I got a library card at the Columbus Metropolitan Library, where the selection was so much larger than Millhaven's that I stood in the middle of the main floor on my first visit and simply looked at the shelves in every direction with an unironic wonder that made the librarian at the desk smile. 3 years after the divorce, on a Wednesday evening in October of 2020, I was at the Pages bookstore for book club when the woman sitting next to me, Janet, a retired school principal in her mid-60s who had been in the group for a year and who had a laugh that made the whole back room feel warmer, leaned over and said, "I want to introduce you to my neighbor. I think you'd like him." I told Janet I wasn't sure I was ready for that. She told me she wasn't asking me to marry anyone, just to meet a person. His name was Henry Pruitt. He was 68, a retired civil engineer, a widower of 4 years, a man who grew heirloom tomatoes in his backyard and had opinions about county road infrastructure and made the best cornbread I have ever eaten. We met for coffee in November of 2020. We met for dinner in December. We walked along the Scioto River on New Year's Day of 2021, and he held my arm on the icy path with a steadiness that felt, in some deep way, like a kind of answer to a question I hadn't quite known I was asking. I am not going to tell you that Henry Pruitt is a perfect man, because he is not, and I have no more interest in perfect men. He is genuine and present and honest, which are the 3 things I know now to require above all others. He forgets where he puts his reading glasses approximately 4 times a day. He has a strong opinion about the correct way to mow a lawn that I find slightly absurd. He laughs at my jokes with a fullness and a timing that tells me he's actually listening, and that, at 65 years old, is an extraordinary thing to discover. We do not live together. We are, as I like to say, enthusiastically proximate. He is 5 minutes from my condominium. I bought the condominium in Clintonville in 2019, using the sale proceeds from the Maple Crest Drive house. And we see each other several times a week, and go to the Scioto Audubon Preserve to watch birds on Sunday mornings when the weather cooperates, and eat dinner at each other's tables with a comfortable regularity that is one of the quiet joys of my present life. My mother, Vera Briggs, passed away in the spring of 2019, 2 years after the divorce was finalized, at the age of 87. She was lucid enough, in her last weeks, to know that I was all right. I held her hand and told her I was all right, and she looked at me with those clear, familiar eyes and said, "I know you are, Dot. You've always been stronger than you knew." Then she slept. I think about her often. I think about the woman she was, the accommodations she made, the peace she kept, the self she set aside. And I think about the ways I learned from her and the ways I moved past what she taught me. And I feel no judgment of her and enormous love for her and a kind of sorrowful gratitude for the path she helped me build, even as she showed me its limits. I am 68 years old now. I have 3 children who call me regularly and visit often and with whom I have relationships of real depth and mutual respect. I have grandchildren, Renata's too, a girl and a boy, who call me Grandma Dot, and who I see every month, and who are, without question, among the finest human beings I have ever met, and I am aware that I am not objective. I have Henry and his cornbread and his opinions about roads. I have the book club at Page's and my container garden and the Columbus Metropolitan Library and the Scioto Audubon on Sunday mornings when the warblers are migrating through. I have a life that is genuinely mine in a way that the life I lived before, however real and full and loved it was in its way, never quite was. I want to spend a few minutes talking to you directly, not through the story, not from behind the narrative, but just me, Dot, talking to whoever you are, wherever you're watching from. If you are a woman of a certain age, 50, 60, 70, anywhere in that range, who is holding a green ledger with an unexplained ATM withdrawal in it, I want to say something to you. I want to say, you are not crazy. The thing you are noticing is real. The fact that you can't quite name it yet does not make it unreal. Trust the part of yourself that is noticing. I put a piece of paper in a drawer for 2 years. I closed a green ledger for 17 years. I turned away from a name on a folder and told myself I hadn't seen it. I did all of these things, and I understand why I did them, and I have forgiven myself for doing them. And I also want to say clearly, you do not have to do those things. You are allowed to open the door before you are completely certain you are ready for what's behind it. You are allowed to ask the question before you have steeled yourself against every possible answer. There is professional support available: counselors, therapists, domestic advocates, legal aid organizations, for women in complicated marriages, and I want to encourage you to seek it. Not because I think your situation is necessarily like mine, but because talking to someone who is trained to help is not weakness. It is wisdom. I wish I had found Maureen Grady earlier. I wish I had called a therapist in 2002, which was the year the Cora text arrived, and